Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are back with another interview, this time with John Englander, who is the author of a new book, Moving to Higher Ground, Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward. It comes out this week, so we'll offer a link to that in the article that accompanies this podcast. He's also previously written a book about sea level rise called High Tide on Main Street. This came out about 9 years ago. It was really a forward-looking book, and we're happy to have John here to talk to us about what is going on the planet. Global atmosphere has already increased by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of the last century, and that's a clear signal that shorelines will begin to march inland as ice that has locked away water on Greenland, in the Arctic, and the Antarctic melts, and of course, sea levels will rise. John has been writing about sea level rise and studying it for decades. Let me just point to a couple of really troubling examples. Louisiana has lost 1,900 square miles since the 1930s to sea level rises and subsidence of land. In Tokyo, this is an article I just read this morning in Nature Climate Change, land subsidence, because you've pumped water and other like gases out of the ground, has caused the parts of Tokyo to sink by 4.5 meters. That's a lot of depth. And in this new book, John looks at the progress of sea level rise and how we can adapt in response, because that really is the problem. We have locked in a future we have to deal with. John, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Great, Mitch. I'm glad to be with you. I've enjoyed your program for years.
Well, I'm pleased that you're here, and especially the week that you introduced your new book. Now, first, let me just ask, how would you describe the overall impact of sea level rise in a nutshell so that somebody can orient themselves to this problem?
It comes down to some very simple things. If you just visualize the landforms on Earth, which are defined by coastlines, that's determined by the level of the ocean. We've been fooled because it's been pretty stable for 6,000 years, which is pretty much recorded human history. Mm-hmm. Anybody who studied geology or the ice ages knows that sea level moves up and down about 400 feet, 120 meters in a regular pattern. And if you imagine what happens when you change the height of sea level by 400 feet, or actually by 600 feet in the extreme sense, the shoreline is going to move miles or tens of miles or hundreds of miles in some places inland or outward, depending upon which way it's going.
Well, you just described an altitude higher than my home is above sea level in the Puget Sound Basin, so now I'm even more scared. But
well, actually,
it won't happen right away.
To set your mind at ease, even if we melt all the ice on the planet, which would be a disaster, sea level would only rise 212 feet more, 65 meters. So you're safe. You're high and dry.
I'm okay. All right. So now, in a TED Talk, and we'll share a link to this as well, you showed what happened to Florida over the course of the last several cycles. And sometimes it's half as large as today. Sometimes it's twice as large as today. And today is just transitory. Can you explain the relationship between CO2, sea level rise, and coastlines?
Sure. Carbon dioxide, CO2, was shown to be a greenhouse gas that trapped heat in the atmosphere, first demonstrated in London in 1859 by Sir John Tyndall on the same desk where Michael Faraday demonstrated magnetism, and this is at the Royal Institution, where I got to explain sea level 2 years ago. So it's a very famous place, and I was privileged to do that. But the concept that carbon dioxide is a clear gas made of carbon and oxygen, obviously, it's a molecule, it's a compound, and that it traps heat is beyond question. It's been demonstrated in public, and of course, it's just basic physics now. So as the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere changes, it will trap more heat. And as the planet gets warmer, most of the heat is stored in the ocean, like a big thermal battery. And as the planet's temperature changes over the long term, the amount of ice on Greenland and Antarctica primarily changes. And if there's more ice, sea level is lower. And if there's less ice, sea level is higher in this very simple sense.
Well, as I said, we've been getting a lot warmer. Besides coastline threats, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a moment, what other weather emanations come from the fact that that thermal battery surface is so much larger when there's more water in the ocean?
Well, there's two huge different effects that let's think about. As the coastline changes and sea level changes, it's not only going to affect the coastline and land where we live, but it also has a huge effect on the ecosystem, because in the marshlands and estuaries, that's where the fish breeding grounds are, and the coral reefs can only take a certain depth, and so on, and temperature, of course. So as sea level changes, it's not just going to change real estate boundaries and property and infrastructure. It's going to have a big effect on the ecosystem because it's going to raise quicker than the ecosystem can adapt in the biosphere. So that's one.
And so that would threaten various species. But do we also expect to see more extreme weather?
Exactly.
As a result of the fact that the ocean simply is just charging the atmosphere with more energy.
Exactly right. That's the second effect I was referring to, and that's particularly related to the Arctic sea ice. One thing that we don't normally stop to think about is that Antarctica, which is 7 times the size of Greenland, but those are two land masses covered by a mile or more of ice.
They're sitting above the water.
Pardon?
They sit above the water rather than being in the water.
That's right, which is a huge difference. We'll come back to that. The Arctic sea ice, which looks similar on a map because it's also often white, is floating ice. The North Pole is water. We don't stop to think about that. But therefore, as the Arctic ice melts, which is happening faster and faster, it's been frozen for 3 million years. So this is a really profound change. And as that Arctic sea ice reduces in square miles, it changes the heat transfer in the Arctic. And that's what's changing weather patterns. That's what's causing the polar vortex and all these other weird weather effects, because what we're winding up with is much more heat transfer, because the 10 feet or 3 meters of ice barrier that was there is gone. Now, interestingly, that floating ice doesn't affect sea level. And we should clarify that. But it's only the ice on land that affects sea level, as well as something called thermal expansion of seawater.
So, and you point this out in the TED Talk as well, like a glass of water with an ice cube in it, roughly 20% of the ice floats above the water, but the water level isn't going to change when that ice melts because the glass is full. The Arctic was full and is full differently now, and as a result is storing more solar energy.
Yes, so let's go back and parse that a little bit. It's actually not quite 20%. It's more like 11%. So we estimated at 10 often, maybe understated a bit. And just like an ice cube in a glass, if it's floating, not touching the bottom, you can see that about 10% is above the surface, just like an iceberg. Mm-hmm. And as that melts, it does not change the level of liquid. Okay. So the icebergs that we're very aware of and the melting and the glaciers glaciers on land are the cause of sea level rise.
And they are melting.
That's right. And they're breaking off into new icebergs, which is like dropping a new ice cube in the glass, which definitely does affect the level.
Right. Okay. So as we watch calving of icebergs off of Antarctica, the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, that's where we're really threatened. So let me ask this. What regions in the U.S. in particular, because our audience is mostly in the United States, are at risk from sea level rise?
Every state and region that touches the ocean, and let's clarify, that's 24 states, by the way. So not the Great Lakes, not directly there, hundreds of feet above sea level, but from Washington State, where you are, all the way down California, around the Gulf of Mexico, up the East Coast of the United States, from Florida to Maine, the little states like Delaware and stuff, and places we don't think of like Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia, or Mobile, Alabama, okay, as well as the iconic places like New Orleans, and of course, Hawaii and Alaska, that all of those coastal areas are greatly affected.
Do you have a sense of how many square miles of land are at risk over the course of this century?
No, not in terms of miles, but it has been estimated that hundreds of millions of people globally are at risk. It depends upon a couple of things. How quickly do we melt the ice? And that gets back to the energy policy. How quickly do we stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere? We don't know that yet. We don't know what we're going to do for energy. We don't know how warm the planet will get, so we can't precisely predict how quickly the ice will melt. Also, the 2 miles of ice roughly that are on Antarctica and Greenland, which again hold over 200 feet of sea level rise potentially, those are hard to model in terms of exactly how they'll melt. If 5% of the ice melts this century, we will have about 10 feet or 3 meters of sea level rise. That's kind of the metric that I recommend as a good estimate.
So you just described a sea level rise that would put roughly 10% of Seattle underwater.
Probably.
And Safeco Field or T-Mobile, whatever they call it now, is going to be wet. That's amazing. This century. Okay. So you mentioned immigration because people are going to be displaced. Do you recommend, as part of the adaptation as we prepare for this, that we have a policy to help support the relocation of people in other countries so that they don't rush here?
Yes, we need to see it as a global issue. So whether it be from Bangladesh or Vietnam or the countries in Northern Africa coming across the Mediterranean, but the Bahamas, I used to live in the Bahamas. I mean, we think of that almost like part of Florida. That's 300,000 or 400,000 people in the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos and other islands. So we need to think of the foreign immigration aspects. You're right. We also need to think about how to create some market forces, I believe, because with this 8 billion people in the world, and let's say that 1 billion are exposed to flooding from rising sea level, it can't just be government relocation programs, even though that may be required. We need to make it more expensive to live in risky areas. And one of the things we're doing that I think, I point out in the book in chapter 7, in fact, talking about insurance, we have some perverse incentives at the moment where we're working to lower the cost of flood insurance. And we're telling people we'll buy them out of their house at face value. Mm-hmm. And actually, those things remove risk from the owner. We need to create a sense of risk so that we don't make the problem worse.
How do you suggest doing that without creating the sense of panic or of exaggeration that so many people have used to discredit this conversation rather than having the conversation?
Well, first of all, I talk, straight talk, plain language, and make it clear. These examples about ice cubes versus, what's happening in Greenland and Antarctica, help people visualize this. The fact is, you say that if you look back in geologic history, 20,000 years ago, sea level was 400 feet lower. That's amazing. And Florida was twice the size. But 120,000 years ago, during the last warm period, sea level was 25 feet higher. These are things that get people's attention because it's not just speculation or theory. It's educating people about Earth history.
Well, and that's interesting. You just described the mechanism that allowed humans to migrate to North America and across the Mediterranean to Europe because water levels were down. You could walk there. It's so interesting because we think of the world as a static place. And when we talk about climate, we talk about like the ideal climate we grew up in as a species. Right. But you're really talking about an environment where we have to continually be prepared to adapt to these things.
Yes.
If we're going to survive more than 20,000 years.
Yeah, no, we think of geologic time as something that's almost theoretical. Mm-hmm. And it's usually thought of in hundreds of thousands of years minimum. And we are now seeing geologic time coming into human time scales, into our lifetimes. In most of our life, most listeners today will be alive by 2050. That's 30 years from now, 3 decades. And if you think ahead, what could happen in 3 decades? We're now looking at a foot or two of sea level rise. Okay, that's an astounding amount. But the last time sea level rose quickly was 11,000 years ago. Pretty long ago, but not that long ago. And it rose 15 feet in 1 century by nature.
Now, and we're pushing the envelope by warming the environment. So it really could just be a tipping point event where suddenly we have a rapidly rising ocean.
That's right.
How is this going to affect economic differences in this country? Because a lot of low-income people are stuck in low altitude homes. Is this going to be a major social and economic issue that we have to prepare for?
Absolutely. It's not just Florida. People like to think of Florida, but you could go right around the perimeter of the United States. But as I say, it's also places from Shanghai to Mumbai and Calcutta and Copenhagen and so on. Every coastal community. We need to think. We need to give up trying to identify the few cities that are affected, like Miami and New Orleans and Venice, which is what everybody does, and realize it's 10,000 coastal communities. And there are wealthy homeowners and there are poor people. And there's the United States of America and there's Bangladesh and Vietnam. This is a transformative concept. It's scary, but we've got to deal with it.
So in your book, you do argue that the government has been almost entirely ineffective in trying to deal with this. And it sounds like part of the problem is that we're trying to deal with this as national governments rather than looking at it as a global problem. Who are you looking to for leadership in response to this challenge?
Well, toward the end of the book, of this new book, Moving to Higher Ground, I talk about, where is the leadership going to come from? Is it going to be politicians, professionals, or the public? And I talk about each, but I really put it on the public. We have to socialize this. We have to talk about this problem. There's a great ignorance thinking we can stop sea level rise by, and some people think that recycling or getting plastics out of the ocean, which are really important efforts, and I support them wholeheartely. They're not going to stop sea level from rising. Okay, so we've got to get educated. That's the first piece. We've got to, I say it's like aging. We're going to get older, and we know ultimately we're going to die. So we can, even though we don't like that. In fact, I talk about the 5 stages of grief in the book, and it's similar. At some point, we embrace that, and we say, okay, we don't know how long we're going to live, so we'll get insurance, we'll have a will, we'll talk to our family, we'll make sure our kids get educated, we'll do different things, right? At some point, we're going to become unhealthy, and at some point we're going to die. Okay, it's not pleasant, but it is what it is.
And most people just ignore that as long as they possibly can.
That's right. But we also, at some point, because we've witnessed it, we do deal with it. Okay, we've never experienced sea level being higher than today in all of human history.
So when does the experience of seeing your parent or your grandparent pass analogously happen with sea level rise? You anticipate an event that just makes us all go, oh my gosh.
No, it's unfortunately, here's the difference. Sea level rise is like the drip filling the bucket. Okay. And if you have a bucket or a bathtub or someplace where water's dripping, it may seem insignificant, but if the drain is closed or it's going to a bucket, you can tell that every day it's getting higher, and that someday it's going to flow over the top of the bucket or the bathtub, right? And so sea level rise is like that. We've never seen it overflow because the last time was 120,000 years ago. We have real reluctance and resistance to accepting it's going to happen. But we can see the evidence already, because from Puget Sound, where you are, to Miami, not far from where I am, and every coastal city, from Boston to San Diego as well, they're noticing that at the king tides, which happen on a monthly, annual, and 19-year cycle, actually, that at the king tide days, the water keeps getting higher. Well, the moon's not getting any closer. It's because base sea level is higher. And then when you get a king tide on top of that, you get more flooding. People are noticing that all over the world.
Do you think though that's a little like having a backache, not seeing your mortality?
It's the trend, though. It's where you see, it's like the drip filling the bucket. You may say, if that bucket overflows in my living room, catching the rain from the roof, let's say, or, the drip, okay, that's going to be a problem. Should I deal with it now, or should I wait till the water overflows the bucket, and floods the living room and ruins my furniture? Okay. So the sea level rise, again, different than old people dying, okay, which we see all the time.
And young people.
We've never seen sea level be higher than it is today as a global. And we're reluctant because it's going to be hugely disruptive. And it is not part of the normal human experience. You have to go back 11,000 years to see rapid sea level rise. And
now, sorry to interrupt, but what are the 3 or 4 things that we should be doing today to prepare for this? You talked about the insurance issue before, stopping giving people a break for living riskily is certainly one important thing. But what else should we be doing?
Well, we should realize that sea level rise is essentially a permanent rise. As it rises inch by inch or centimeter by centimeter, it's a gradual thing we can plan for. On top of that, we get the extreme tides. And on top of that, we get storms or bad weather events. And on top of that, we get heavy rainfall, which also runs downslope and multiplies as runoff or down a river. So flooding comes from all of those things. And one of the things we can do is to start thinking about sea level as the permanent baseline, and then temporary floods events on top of that. But the total flooding is the combination.
Right.
Okay, that's a concept change. Again, in all of the last century, sea level rose as a global average about 10 inches. Okay, the rate is doubling almost every decade right now.
Right.
It's still only 5 millimeters a year. Okay, about 0.2 of an inch. But it's like the pandemic. When we were warned a year ago about the pandemic, about what would happen with growth curves and exponential growth, and some people had trouble believing we'd ever, have 100,000 people or millions of people dying. Of course, we've seen that. That happens quickly, and so it's the growth curves we need to look at. Okay, and sea level is the rate. Last century was in millimeters, 1.7 millimeters. Then, since we took satellite measurements of sea level, it got up to about 3 millimeters in the last 30 years. And in the last decade, it's now 5 millimeters a year.
So flood insurance is one thing we should change. Switching to EVs or electrification so that we're not burning fossil fuels. What else? And what are the policy things we should be doing to try to at least slow the process?
Well, to slow the process, we do need to slow the warming. You're right. So whether it's electric vehicles or solar energy or renewables, that's great. But that's not going to quickly affect sea level rise because we've already stored so much heat in the ocean. The oceans are over 1 degree Celsius, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. Even if we went to 100% solar and renewable energy today, that heat's not going anywhere. So slowing the warming is good, and maybe we can reduce sea level rate, the rate of sea level rise by about 20 or 30%. But that's about it. So we've got to do both. We've got to work on the energy part, slow the warming. We've got to be more resilient to the flood events, which happen all the time because they're getting worse. And 3 is we got to begin adapting to sea level rise, which is now unstoppable.
So what are the things that you recommend we do as a society to prepare for that, to the adaptation?
Great question. So I recommend that we start thinking about the future as 3 phases, 3 timeframes, short, medium, and long term. We tend to do that naturally in our planning for our retirement or our kids' education. But if you think the next decade or so is short term, medium term's mid-century, 30 years from now, a home mortgage. Long term's 100 years from now. Most buildings and infrastructure last that long. If we think short, medium, and long term, this becomes a lot more practical and realistic. If somebody's 80 years old and has good savings and has a house inland and a house at the beach or on the coast, that's fine, no problem. But if we're designing infrastructure, roads, railroads, airports, power plants, refineries for the future, they should contemplate 10 feet of sea level rise. So we need to plan differently where there's a long-term horizon. And we need to elevate buildings, we need to change zoning, but we can do it in the short, medium, and long term so that we avoid the catastrophe, which is we don't want to change things now for 100 years from now. We understand that, but we tend to keep kicking the can down the road and procrastinating. We tend to keep saying, well, we'll deal with that 10 years from now. And the problem is the building we design tomorrow, or the bridge, or the tunnel, or the roadway, now is the time to put that into the planning for the coming century.
So do you see evidence of this? I know this just came out, but in the Biden infrastructure plan, do you see evidence they're thinking that way?
They want to. There's indications they'd like to, but unfortunately, they're actually missing the sea level part because their focus is all on the very important energy part, how to slow the warming. They look at being more resilient to flooding in the next decade or two, which is the normal time frame for government planning. They're not adding the third element, that sea level is going to be 5 or 10 feet higher. And how should that be brought into current design criteria?
Okay.
They're silent on that.
Wow. Okay. So we need to make some changes there. Now, we know that we've locked in sea level rise. We've also locked in warming to a certain degree. Do you see any viable technology or strategies, natural strategies for reducing the temperature of the Earth that we could begin to implement now?
The category is now called geoengineering. How do we intentionally change the Earth's climate or temperature? There's a lot of effort, and there was a new National Academy of Sciences report just a week or two ago. It's getting more and more attention. There's a center headed by a friend of mine, Sir David King, the Climate Repair Center, looking at this at Cambridge University. But there's many efforts. There's another group, the Healthy Climate Alliance, is trying to figure out how do we get back to the healthy climate we think of when we were kids.
They changed their name, by the way.
That's right.
They're now the Foundation for Climate Restoration.
Thank you very much. And I'm a member of that, so I should have known that. But thank you. And we need to envision the future differently. We need to see where we can do this engineering. It's going to come down to either removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or reducing the amount of solar radiation we receive. And that could be by spraying salt water on clouds and increasing our reflectance rate. There are ideas to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequester it down in the earth. And there's some experiments about that in Iceland now and some other places. So we'll do those things, and we should. And those will help to slow the warming, but they're not going to stop sea level from rising because we've already got that heat in the ocean.
Yep, we built it in. This is the future we made.
Yeah.
John, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Mitch, I've really enjoyed it.
Well, good. I'm glad. Hey, everybody. John Englander is the new author of the new book, Moving to Higher Ground, Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward. It comes out this week. Look for a link in the article. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of the planet. Have a green day.